I'm not afraid. Because I trust all of you, that's the first thing.
Ibrahim Traoré doesn't hide behind armored cars or foreign advisors. He stands in the crowd, unguarded, unshaken, and unafraid. When asked why, he says something most leaders wouldn't dare. Because I trust my people. That single line captures the soul of a new Africa, one that believes strength is born from unity, not fear. And that belief came alive in one of his most powerful speeches, a message that tore through old narratives of dependence, spoke of Africa's mental liberation, and showed how a continent once lectured by the world has now become the world's teacher. Let's get started.
I'm not afraid. Because I trust all of you, that's the first thing. You have to trust the people, because it's the people who entrusted us with this mission. And I trust the people that they will understand. And that's why we don't hesitate to stand before the people, to explain the situation to them and tell them what's going on. And that helps maintain a very good relationship. That's the first thing.
In an age where most leaders rule from behind walls, Ibrahim Traoré walks through crowds with an ease that feels almost unreal. He doesn't flinch when hands reach out to touch him. He doesn't look over his shoulder for bodyguards. When he says, "I trust my people, that's why I'm not afraid," it's more than just confidence. It's a philosophy of leadership Africa hasn't seen in generations. It's the idea that true power doesn't come from how many soldiers you command, but how deeply your people believe in your cause. This belief isn't born out of naivety. It's born from history, a bloody one. Traoré understands the impact of fear on African leaders. For decades, rulers were taught that to stay alive, they must fear their people more than their colonizers. Western-backed coups, intelligence networks, and financial blackmail created a political culture where African presidents became prisoners in their own palaces. But Traoré is rewriting that rulebook. He has seen that the only immunity against foreign manipulation is trust, not in Western guarantees, but in the heartbeat of the people who walk the streets he walks. When he steps out among the youth of Ouagadougou, there's no glass barrier, no stage. The young see themselves in him, a soldier who rose not from family privilege, but from the trenches of frustration. His calmness in a sea of poverty, his composure in a country surrounded by enemies, all stem from that trust. It's not political theater, it's a mirror. He's showing Africans what it looks like when a leader doesn't hide behind fear, when leadership isn't a performance, but participation. This fearlessness is what unsettles the West, because they know fear is the easiest weapon to control a continent. They've used it for decades, through debt, media, and the illusion of international approval. But a man who isn't afraid to lose power can't be bribed or coerced. That's what makes Traoré dangerous to their order, not his military background, but his moral immunity. He's not building trust to gain loyalty, he's building it to destroy dependency. To the world, he may look like another young revolutionary. But to Africans, he represents something far older, the spirit of communal protection that existed long before colonization. In many African societies, the leader was not a ruler, but a custodian, a protector of collective dignity. Traoré's return to that model is a silent rebellion against the imported idea that leadership means domination. When he says he trusts his people, it's an echo of ancestral governance, where survival depended on shared courage, not individual power. And this is precisely why his leadership feels different. He doesn't speak like a man trying to prove his worth on the international stage. He speaks like a man who knows his worth because his people already gave it to him. That bond of trust is the foundation of his revolution, a foundation so unbreakable that even sanctions, propaganda, or sabotage can't erode it. But this trust doesn't exist in isolation. It's part of a larger awakening across Africa, one that's drawing the world's attention. When the West sees a leader who trusts his people, they see a challenge to centuries of hierarchy. When the East looks, it sees an opportunity to learn a new model of social cohesion. And that's exactly what's beginning to happen. The world's greatest powers are no longer coming to Africa to teach, but to learn. Because the real question is no longer why Traoré isn't afraid. It's why the rest of the world suddenly wants to understand where that fearlessness comes from. How did a continent once colonized become a masterclass in resilience and discipline?
Today, many forces, foreigners, are now seeking to come and train with us. You wouldn't believe it. The world's greatest powers want to come and train with us, with our soldiers. But it's not just about training. They want to learn how we do things, how we operate, who trains us.
When Ibrahim Traoré said that even the world's greatest militaries now come to Africa to learn how to train, many outside the continent laughed, until they saw it happening. Western soldiers, once stationed across Africa to teach counterinsurgency tactics, quietly study the same desert warfare techniques, community-based defense systems, and moral cohesion that African armies have perfected under impossible pressure. The question is no longer why Traoré isn't afraid. It's why the world is suddenly fascinated by the strength that fearlessness has produced. That curiosity is born from contradiction. For centuries, Africa was painted as a continent in constant need of guidance, a student perpetually waiting for the West's next lecture. Yet, in the last decade, African nations under siege from sanctions, resource theft, and insurgency have built internal resilience that no think tank could design. When Western powers lose a war, they hold hearings. When Africans lose one, they adapt, quietly, efficiently, relentlessly. This ability to recover and reorganize without external support has become the new definition of strength. What global powers now see in Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger is not chaos, but an alternative model of power, one that isn't anchored in nuclear weapons or trillion-dollar budgets, but in people who believe in something larger than themselves. African defense has become a philosophy, a blend of ancient discipline and modern necessity. Where Western soldiers are trained for short campaigns, African fighters endure endless wars yet remain committed. They don't fight for salary, they fight for sovereignty. It's that moral clarity that's drawing attention. Western academies are asking how poorly equipped armies are defeating militants trained by their own contractors. The answer lies not in weapons but in willpower. Traoré and his allies have redefined training itself. It isn't just physical readiness, it's ideological alignment. Soldiers are taught to understand why they fight, not just how. And when conviction becomes a weapon, imported doctrines lose value. Even civilian sectors are echoing this reversal. From agriculture to technology, African innovation is being studied in global conferences for its self-reliance. The same nations that once dictated best practices are now attending African forums to understand community-driven development, informal market systems, and resource-based diplomacy. The humility of that shift is historic. The colonizer has become the observer. Yet this global fascination exposes an uncomfortable truth. Many of those coming to learn aren't here to honor Africa, they're here to dissect it, to decode the secret of how the continent resists control. Because if Africa can function outside the Western orbit, it threatens the very logic of Western dominance. Traoré knows this, which is why he speaks not with arrogance, but with warning. If you want to understand Africa's strength, you must first abandon the illusion of superiority. Still, there's another layer to this transformation that cannot be ignored. For Africa to teach the world effectively, it must first free its own mind. What good is global recognition if the continent still narrates itself through colonial language and Western media filters? That is the paradox Traoré points out. While the world comes to learn from Africa, Africa itself still learns through Western eyes. So the question that follows naturally is this: how can a continent so rich in wisdom and resilience still be imprisoned by invisible chains? How can Africans lead the world militarily and economically, yet still be defined by stories written in London, Paris, and New York? That contradiction between outer strength and inner captivity is what Traoré confronts next. It's not a war fought with guns anymore, but with cameras, classrooms, and words. Because before Africa can truly lead the world, it must first liberate its own mind. Let's pause for a second to say, big thank you to the Black Culture Diary community, where Black voices, stories, and legacies are preserved and amplified. By becoming a member, you're not just supporting the channel, you're becoming part of a powerful cultural movement. Let's continue.
The work of imperialism. Of course, many among you were trained by them. That's it, you went to the white man's school, as we like to say. They're the ones who trained you in journalism. So I don't often blame you when people try to behave like them. But I speak so that people become aware that this is about our homeland. Look, this morning, for example, read the headlines in the newspapers in France. They might tell you that there was a mobilization to put pressure on the Prime Minister. They won't tell you that there was a march against the government or anything like that. But if it were in Burkina, you would say there was a march against the government. Do you understand? The French used to call us, and still call us, putiche, junta, and so on. That's French. But the journalists also called us putiche, junta, and so on. Why? Why follow? Following blindly, that's still slavery. I want us to move away from that. Every state must fight for its own interests. Journalists fight for their own interests. So why shouldn't we fight for our interests in Africa? So that's it. It's not just the journalists. I also blame some intellectuals who appear on TV panels in Africa. When they speak up, you start asking questions. But is he African? Well, genetically, he's not from here.
If Africa can teach the world resilience, why does it still struggle to teach itself freedom? That's the paradox Traoré exposes. The battlefield has changed, but the chains have simply evolved. Gone are the colonial governors and gunboats. Today, control arrives wrapped in news headlines, university syllabuses, and international narratives. The weapon isn't the rifle anymore, it's the story. Traoré puts it bluntly. The media went to the white man's school. This is also slavery. Behind that statement lies a brutal truth. The mind is the last colony. For generations, Africa's journalists, intellectuals, and policymakers have been trained to think within boundaries drawn by others. They graduate fluent in Western ideals, polished in Western etiquette, and loyal to Western validation. They can quote Voltaire, but not Sankara. They can explain NATO strategy, but not the strategy of their own liberation movements. That's not education, that's indoctrination disguised as sophistication. This mental conditioning is why African successes often need Western applause to feel legitimate. When a Western outlet calls an African leader bold, we celebrate. When they call him authoritarian, we apologize. The irony is painful. Africa fights for sovereignty with one hand while begging for approval with the other. And that is exactly what Traoré wants to end. The idea that African greatness must first be certified abroad. But to dismantle this mindset, you first have to recognize how deep it runs. It's not only in universities or media houses, it's in how we measure success itself. Westernized Africa celebrates skyscrapers over self-sufficiency, foreign investors over local entrepreneurs, and English fluency over indigenous thought. This cultural mimicry keeps the continent forever performing, never defining. Even revolutions start to look like imported products, dramatic, televised, and short-lived, because their narratives are crafted not by those who bleed for change, but by those who broadcast it. Traoré's message here is not a rejection of learning, it's a demand for ownership. He's not saying Africans shouldn't study abroad. He's saying they must return home mentally, not just physically. Knowledge imported without context becomes a Trojan horse. It looks like progress, but carries dependence inside. That's why Burkina Faso is focusing on indigenous education. Schools that teach children to see their land not as poverty, but as potential. To study not only the world, but themselves. And this transformation must start with those who tell Africa's story. If journalists keep echoing Western fears, Africa will keep living inside them. The continent's press should not ask how Europe views Africa. It should ask how Africa views the world. That shift in perspective turns every microphone into a weapon of liberation. Because if Africans control their own narrative, they control their destiny. The mental war, however, is not fought overnight. Colonialism lasted centuries, and decolonizing the mind will take more than slogans. It requires rebuilding national pride through productivity. Because when people start seeing tangible results, stable food systems, working industries, and independent economies, they no longer crave foreign approval. The mind heals when the soil feeds. And that's exactly where Traoré's philosophy leads next. He knows that mental freedom means little if people still depend on foreign aid to eat or foreign firms to dig their gold. Real independence must touch the stomach before it touches the spirit. That's why, after confronting the mind, his next move was to rebuild the land itself, to turn freedom from a word into a harvest. The question now becomes, what happens when Africa starts producing for itself, feeding itself, and financing itself? That is where the real revolution begins. Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now.
We can see that these are macroeconomic figures. We are aware of this and we constantly review the situation with the Minister of Finance. Efforts are being made. It's true that there are areas that have been secured which allow us to produce. And so agricultural production has increased significantly, which allows for processing at the level of the small units we have, but also for exporting the surplus of certain products. So this contributes greatly to the trade balance. There is also the issue of mining itself. So there are a number of mines that had stopped operating, if you remember. Some in 2020, others even in 2018, but they have also resumed operations. And all of these contributes to that growth. And we are continuing in this direction.
When people liberate their minds, the next instinct is to liberate their hands. That's why, after breaking the chains of dependency and thought, Traoré turned toward the soil. Because if a continent still needs others to feed its children or extract its gold, then its freedom remains ornamental. The only cure for mental enslavement is creation, the ability to produce, own, and sustain. And that is precisely what Burkina Faso is beginning to do under Traoré's leadership. Agriculture was his first battlefield. For decades, foreign aid agencies flooded African fields with promises, fertilizers that came with conditions, loans that came with lectures, and projects that collapsed as soon as the donors flew home. Traoré saw through the pattern. He realized that the problem wasn't that Africa couldn't feed itself. It was that outsiders profited more when it didn't. So he reversed the logic. Instead of waiting for help, Burkina Faso began relying on its own farmers, engineers, and cooperatives. Seeds were distributed locally. State-owned grain reserves were revived. Youth training programs focused on irrigation, soil management, and indigenous crop science rather than imported agricultural innovation that never fit African climates. The results were not just economic, they were psychological. For the first time in decades, farmers began to see their labor as part of a national mission, not a struggle for survival. They weren't working for the IMF's growth statistics, but for Burkina Faso's dignity. Villages that once waited for food shipments are now sending grain to neighboring countries. That's not a statistic, that's a symbol. It's the land reclaiming its pride. Then came the mines, the veins of Africa's exploitation. Traoré didn't just nationalize them for political symbolism, he did it to correct a historical crime. For generations, Africa's richest deposits of gold, cobalt, and uranium were extracted by foreign companies that paid royalties so small they could fit in a banker's wallet. The profits built European skylines while African towns remained in the dark. Traoré's government began renegotiating contracts, raising state stakes, and investing in refining capacity inside Burkina Faso. When a nation refines its own gold, it refines its power. No longer does it ship raw wealth abroad only to buy it back as jewelry. And this economic awakening has become contagious. Across the Sahel, a quiet network of cooperation is forming. Niger with its uranium, Mali with its lithium, Guinea with its bauxite, and Burkina Faso with its gold, all determined to trade among themselves before trading with the world. They are crafting a new market built on reciprocity, not exploitation. The West calls it resource nationalism. Africans call it justice long delayed. But Traoré's vision stretches beyond resources. He sees industrialization not as an imported miracle, but as a homegrown necessity. Local factories are being built to process cotton, rice, and metals, turning raw potential into finished value. And for every project completed, there's a deeper message. Africa is not poor, it was plundered. Once the plunder stops, prosperity begins. Still, Traoré's revolution isn't about isolation. It's about negotiation from strength. He wants partnerships, not pity. When Africa can feed itself and fund its own growth, it speaks to the world not as a debtor, but as an equal. That's why this shift terrifies old powers, because self-sufficiency ends dependency. And dependency was always the quiet empire. But production alone doesn't complete the story. A continent can build industries and still crumble if it forgets its purpose. The final stage of Africa's reawakening isn't just material, it's moral. Once Africans reclaim their resources, what do they do with that power? Will they repeat the greed that once destroyed them, or will they build a model of unity that redefines global power? When a continent learns to feed itself, mine its own gold, and think with its own mind, something extraordinary happens. It stops being managed and starts being remembered. That's what the world is witnessing now. Africa isn't just rebuilding its economy or rewriting its story. It's quietly designing a new world order, one that isn't measured in currency or military bases, but in moral power. The revolution Traoré represents isn't just Burkinabe, and it isn't just economic, it's civilizational. For centuries, Africa's story was told in the past tense, as something that once was the cradle of humanity, the birthplace of kingdoms, the supplier of the world's wealth. But now, it's being told in the present tense again. Traoré's leadership, and that of a growing circle of like-minded leaders across the Sahel, signals that Africa is not waiting for global approval to lead. It's already leading by example. This new order is not declared in speeches but demonstrated in practice, through independence that sustains itself. This transformation is spiritual as much as it is political. Africa's reawakening carries an energy the world hasn't felt in centuries, the energy of a people who have rediscovered purpose. The West built its empires by extracting from others. Africa's rising generation seeks to build prosperity by empowering its own. The difference is profound. One model breeds dependence, the other breeds dignity. And in a world drowning in greed, that moral clarity has become Africa's greatest export. But Traoré's message extends beyond Burkina Faso's borders. He understands that true independence cannot exist in isolation. The liberation of one African nation means little if its neighbors remain chained. That's why his rhetoric constantly invokes we instead of I. We must stand together, he tells audiences, not as an appeal, but as a command. Because if one country produces while another depends, the continent remains divided, and division is the oxygen of control. The real revolution, therefore, is continental. It's in Africa where Mali's resources power Burkina's factories, and Burkina's crops feed Niger's soldiers. It's the rebirth of pan-Africanism, not as a slogan, but as a system. This pan-Africanism is no longer romantic idealism, it's strategic survival. As global power blocks fracture and old alliances crumble, Africa's unity is becoming its greatest defense. The West is consumed by internal crises, debt, polarization, and moral fatigue. The East, though rising, is also seeking new partners and resources. In this shifting world, Africa is no longer a pawn, it's the board itself. Whoever wishes to play must now sit at Africa's table, and that table no longer serves scraps. Still, Traoré's vision doesn't end at independence, it evolves into leadership. The same trust that began between a leader and his people must now grow between nations. The same courage that expelled foreign bases must now build continental institutions strong enough to stand without them. Africa's future lies not in imitation, but in innovation. Governance that draws from its communal values, economics that prioritize people over profit, and diplomacy that speaks with one voice rather than 54 divided ones. The new African order will not announce itself with parades or flags. It will reveal itself in quiet victories, when African students graduate from African universities proud of their identity, when African factories outbid foreign suppliers, and when African media shape global debates rather than react to them. That's when the prophecy becomes reality, when the continent that once fueled the world's progress begins fueling its own destiny. This is the Africa Traoré envisions, an Africa not defined by its scars, but by its scars turned into blueprints. An Africa that trusts, teaches, unlearns, builds, and finally leads. The journey began with one man saying he trusts his people. But the destination is far larger, a continent learning to trust itself. And when that happens fully, the world won't just come to Africa to learn, it will come to follow. Do you think Africa's new confidence can truly reshape how the world defines power? Let us know in the comment section what it would take for Africans everywhere to start trusting themselves as much as Traoré trusts his people. Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.